Go back to Africa where you belong. The words tore through the busy airport terminal like shattered glass, silencing conversations and freezing travelers in their tracks, as a well-dressed businessman pointed an accusatory finger at a composed black woman who stood quietly holding her boarding pass, her expression calm despite the venom directed her way. The boardroom of Horizon Airways hummed with quiet efficiency as morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bustling airfield below. CEO Zara Johnson sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, her navy blazer immaculate, her presence commanding the attention of 12 department heads who hung on her every word as she reviewed the quarterly reports that showed another record-breaking period of growth for the airline she had built from nothing. Passenger satisfaction is up 8%, but we're seeing concerning trends in incident reports, said Marcus Chen, her head of operations sliding a tablet across the table toward her with charts displaying complaint data that made Zara's jaw tighten slightly. She studied the numbers with the same intensity she once used to analyze flight patterns during her early days as a commercial pilot back when airline executives would barely give her the time of day, let alone a seat in their boardrooms. The irony wasn't lost on her that 15 years ago she had been just another young black woman trying to break into an industry that seemed designed to keep people like her on the ground rather than in the cockpit. She remembered every rejection letter, every interviewer who suggested she might be better suited for customer service, every time someone questioned whether she had the right temperament to handle the responsibility of flying multi-million-dollar aircraft filled with hundreds of lives. "What kind of incidents are we talking about specifically?" Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from the uncomfortable shifting of chairs around the table and the way her assistant Sarah Kim was already pulling up additional files on her laptop with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen this pattern before. Passenger disputes involving bias-related comments. Marcus replied carefully. The kind of corporate speak that meant he was trying to discuss racism without actually saying the word, in a room full of executives who preferred their discrimination discussions wrapped in euphemisms. Several crew members have reported feeling unsupported when handling these situations, and we've had 3 viral social media incidents in the past month involving passengers making inappropriate remarks. Zara nodded slowly, her fingers drumming against the table as she processed information that confirmed what she had suspected for months. The airline industry had made progress in many areas, but passenger behavior seemed to be regressing with people feeling increasingly comfortable expressing prejudices they might have once kept hidden, especially when they thought they were dealing with service workers who had no power to fight back. "I want a comprehensive review of our incident response protocols," she said finally, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had helped her navigate hostile boardrooms and emergency landings with equal composure. "And I want to understand exactly how we're supporting our crew when they face discrimination from passengers, because if we're not protecting our people, we're failing at the most basic level of leadership." The room buzzed with the energy of executives taking notes and already planning follow-up meetings. But Zara's mind was elsewhere, remembering her father's advice from 20 years ago when she had come home crying after being told by a flight instructor that she didn't have the right personality for aviation. "Don't get angry, sweetheart," he had said, wrapping her in a bear hug that smelled of motor oil and hope. "Get altitude, rise above their small thinking, and then show them what they missed." "Actually," Zara said, standing and gathering her files with the decisive movements of someone who had just made an important decision, "I'm going to take the afternoon flight to Denver myself. It's been too long since I've been in the cockpit, and I think I need to see firsthand what our crews are dealing with out there." Denver International Airport pulsed with the controlled chaos of a Tuesday morning rush business travelers, rolling sleek carry-ons while families juggled excited children and oversized bags. Everyone moving with the purposeful urgency of people trying to catch flights that would carry them to whatever important destinations awaited them across the country. Near Gate B, 15 8-year-old Emma Chen sat cross-legged on the industrial carpet beside her grandmother Lee, completely absorbed in a drawing that featured an airplane soaring through cotton ball clouds with a figure visible in the cockpit window that looked remarkably like a woman with her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her colored pencils were spread around her like a rainbow as she worked with the intense concentration that only children possessed when they were creating something that mattered deeply to them. "Emma, what are you drawing now?" Grandmother Lee asked in accented English, her voice warm with the patience of someone who had raised 3 generations of dreamers and understood that art was how children made sense of a world that often seemed too big and complicated for their small hands to grasp. "It's Captain Emma flying to China to visit you when you live there," the little girl replied without looking up from her work, adding careful details to the pilot's uniform that she had studied in aviation magazines her parents bought to encourage her unusual obsession with flying. "She has special wings that help her find her way through storms, and she speaks 3 languages so she can talk to people from everywhere." Grandmother Lee smiled, remembering her own journey to America 40 years ago, when she had stared out airplane windows and wondered about the invisible hands guiding her toward a new life. "Maybe someday you really will be a pilot, little one. The sky is big enough for all kinds of dreamers." Across the gate area, David Richardson paced back and forth while talking rapidly into his Bluetooth headset, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone whose world was crumbling faster than he could rebuild it. His beige suit was expensive, but wrinkled. His hair showed stress gray at the temples, and his free hand clenched and unclenched as he listened to news that was clearly not what he wanted to hear about his struggling consulting firm. "What do you mean?" Peterson pulled his contract. David's voice rose above the ambient airport noise, causing several passengers to look in his direction with the mixture of annoyance and sympathy that frequent travelers reserved for people having public meltdowns. "We had a handshake agreement, Jim." A handshake. That used to mean something in this business before everyone started playing these political games. He paused, listening to whatever his business partner was telling him, and the color drained from his face as he processed information that was clearly devastating. 6 months ago, he had been running a successful firm with 12 employees and a client roster that read like a who's who of Denver business leaders. But a series of bad decisions and an increasingly toxic personality had driven away customers who no longer wanted to associate with his brand of angry blame, everyone else leadership. "The divorce is already costing me everything, and now this." David continued, his voice cracking slightly as the weight of his situation pressed down on him like the altitude changes he hated about flying. "How am I supposed to explain to Rachel that Daddy can't afford her dance classes anymore because the whole world has lost its mind?" Emma looked up from her drawing at the sound of the distressed man's voice, her young face creasing with the concern that children naturally felt when adults around them were struggling. "Grandma, why is that man so upset?" she whispered, her small voice carrying the kind of innocent observation that often revealed truths adults preferred to ignore. Sometimes grown-ups forget how to solve problems without getting angry. Grandmother Lee replied quietly, watching David pace with the patient understanding of someone who had survived real hardship and recognized the difference between genuine crisis and self-created chaos. When people feel small inside, they sometimes try to make others feel small too, but that never fixes what's really broken. As boarding time approached the gate area, filled with the usual mix of travelers, business people checking emails until the last possible moment, families organizing snacks and entertainment for restless children, elderly couples helping each other navigate the complexities of modern air travel, and solo travelers lost in books or podcasts that would help the hours pass more quickly once they were airborne. Zara Johnson arrived at the gate with the understated confidence of someone who belonged everywhere she went, carrying a simple leather briefcase and wearing a crisp white blouse under her navy blazer that spoke of professional competence without the need for flashy displays of wealth or status. She moved through this crowd with purpose, but without urgency, acknowledging the gate agent with a polite nod as she confirmed her seat assignment and settled into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs to review flight plans on her tablet. Most passengers didn't give her a second glance, seeing only another business traveler preparing for another routine flight. But Emma looked up from her coloring and stared with the frank curiosity that children directed toward anything that captured their interest. Something about the way Zara carried herself reminded Emma of the pilots in her magazines, that combination of alertness and calm confidence that suggested someone who could handle whatever challenges might arise at 30,000 feet above the earth. The boarding announcement crackled over the gate area speakers with the routine efficiency of thousands of similar announcements made every day across the country. But what happened next would transform an ordinary Tuesday morning into a moment that would be replayed millions of times across social media and spark conversations about dignity, respect, and accountability that would echo far beyond the confines of Denver International Airport. We will now begin boarding Horizon Airways Flight 447 with service to Chicago, starting with our first-class passengers and those requiring special assistance. The gate agent announced, her voice carrying the practiced cheerfulness of someone who had repeated these words thousands of times without really thinking about the human dynamics they would set in motion. Zara gathered her belongings and moved toward the boarding line with the efficient movements of someone who traveled frequently and knew how to navigate airport procedures smoothly. But as she approached the gate agent's podium, she noticed that the young woman behind the counter was looking past her toward the first-class passengers, still organizing their carry-on bags and finishing conversations behind her in line. "Excuse me, Miss the Gate," agent said with a polite but dismissive tone that suggested she assumed Zara was confused about boarding procedures. "First-class passengers are boarding now. Economy will be called in just a few minutes if you'd like to wait over there." She gestured toward the main seating area with the kind of automatic assumption that revealed more about her unconscious biases than any conscious decision to discriminate. Zara smiled patiently and held up her boarding pass. The thick cardstock clearly marked with first class, Seat 2A in bold letters that should have been impossible to misread under the bright fluorescent lighting of the gate area. "I believe I am a first-class passenger," she said quietly, her voice carrying no trace of irritation, despite the subtle insult she had just received from someone who was supposedly trained to provide excellent customer service to all travelers regardless of their appearance. Behind her in line, David Richardson had been listening to this exchange while scrolling through increasingly desperate text messages from his business partner, and the combination of his mounting personal stress and the gate agent's obvious mistake triggered something ugly and dangerous in his already fragile emotional state. The airline industry had become just another symbol of everything he felt was wrong with the world, another place where the rules he thought he understood no longer seemed to apply, another reminder that his comfortable position at the top of various hierarchies was being challenged by people he had never expected to compete with for status and respect. "Of course, she's cutting in line," David said loudly enough for everyone in the gate area to hear his voice carrying the kind of aggressive certainty that people used when they wanted to rally others to their cause. "They always think the rules don't apply to them, don't they? Push their way to the front and act like they own the place when we all know how they really afforded those tickets." The words hit the gate area like a physical blow, creating a circle of shocked silence that spread outward from David's position, until even conversations 20 feet away had stopped, as people processed what they had just heard. Several passengers pulled out their phones with the instinctive reaction of people who recognized that they were witnessing something that needed to be documented, while others looked around uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't heard the ugly implications beneath David's supposedly innocent observation about line cutting. Zara turned slowly to face him, her expression remaining perfectly composed despite the adrenaline now flowing through her system as she recognized the particular combination of entitlement and aggression that she had encountered too many times throughout her career. She had learned long ago that responding to provocations with anger or defensiveness usually played right into the hands of people who wanted to paint her as emotional or unprofessional, So instead, she simply looked at David with the calm assessment of someone evaluating a technical problem that required a measured solution. "Sir, I'm simply boarding in my assigned group with my valid ticket," she said evenly, her voice carrying across the gate area with the kind of clarity that made everyone stop what they were doing to listen. "Perhaps there's been some confusion, but I'm sure we can resolve this without making other passengers uncomfortable." But David was past the point where reasonable responses could penetrate his spiral of anger and resentment, and the sight of this composed woman refusing to be intimidated by his aggressive posturing only made him more determined to assert whatever authority he thought his first-class ticket and his pale skin afforded him in this situation. He stepped closer to her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the network of stress lines around his eyes that spoke of months of sleepless nights and mounting pressures. "Go back to Africa where you belong." The words exploded from him with shocking violence, each syllable dripping with centuries of hatred and the kind of raw prejudice that most people had learned to hide behind coded language and plausible deniability. "You people are ruining everything that used to work in this country, taking opportunities away from real Americans who built this industry with their own hard work." The silence that followed was absolute and crushing, the kind of quiet that happened when a room full of people simultaneously held their breath while processing something so far outside the bounds of normal human interaction that it took several seconds for their minds to catch up with what their ears had just heard. Emma Chen looked up from her coloring book with wide eyes, her young brain struggling to understand why the upset man was being so deliberately cruel to the nice lady who had been minding her own business. Grandmother Lee put a protective arm around Emma and whispered something in Mandarin that sounded like a prayer, or perhaps a curse, while other passengers began reaching for their phones with movements that suggested they knew they were about to witness something that would be talked about for months or years to come. The gate agent stood frozen behind her podium, clearly unprepared for this level of passenger conflict, despite whatever training she might have received about handling difficult situations. Airport security guards materialized from the crowd with the practiced efficiency of people who dealt with disruptions every day. But Zara raised one hand slightly to signal that she didn't need immediate intervention, her gesture carrying the authority of someone who was used to commanding respect even in chaotic situations. She looked directly at David for a long moment, studying his face with the kind of clinical attention she might give to weather patterns before making important flight decisions. "Sir, I understand you're upset about something, but your comments are inappropriate and hurtful to the other passengers here, especially the children who are listening," she said with the calm professionalism that had guided her through countless emergencies, both in the air and in boardrooms full of people who had underestimated her. "I hope you'll consider how your words affect everyone around you, and I trust you'll conduct yourself more appropriately once we're aboard the aircraft." David's face flushed deeper red at her refusal to engage in the screaming match he had been trying to provoke, and for a moment it looked like he might escalate further. But the sight of security officers moving closer and the forest of phone cameras now recording his every word seemed to penetrate his rage enough to make him step back slightly. "You just wait," he muttered, loud enough for the microphones to catch but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. "We'll see how long your attitude lasts once we get on that plane, and you remember who really belongs in first class." Zara simply nodded to the gate agent, who had finally recovered enough to process her boarding pass with trembling fingers, and walked down the jet bridge with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout the entire confrontation, leaving behind a gate area buzzing with whispered conversations about what they had just witnessed and what might happen next during what was supposed to be a routine flight from Denver to Chicago. The narrow aisle of Horizon Airways Flight 447 felt even more confined than usual as passengers filed aboard with the subdued energy of people who had just witnessed something uncomfortable and weren't quite sure how to process what they had seen or what role they should play in whatever drama might unfold during the next 3 hours at cruising altitude. David Richardson pushed past other first-class passengers with the aggressive entitlement of someone who believed that his airplane ticket gave him license to claim whatever space he wanted, regardless of assigned seating or basic courtesy toward fellow travelers. "Can you believe what just happened back there?" David announced to anyone within earshot as he shoved his carry-on bag into the overhead compartment with unnecessary force that made the plastic bins rattle ominously. Used to be that airlines had standards about who they let in first class, but now, apparently, anyone with a stolen credit card can buy their way up here and act like they own the plane. The businessman seated across the aisle from David's assigned seat looked up from his laptop with the expression of someone who was trying to decide whether to engage with this obviously agitated person or pretend to be too absorbed in work to participate in whatever rant was building steam in the premium cabin. Most frequent travelers had developed strategies for avoiding conversations with unstable passengers, but David's volume and aggressive body language made it impossible to ignore his presence completely. Flight attendant Keisha Williams moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, helping passengers stow their belongings and checking that seat belts were properly fastened, but she couldn't help noticing the tension radiating from seat 2A where David had settled himself like an angry king surveying a kingdom that wasn't meeting his standards. She had been working for Horizon Airways for 3 years and had developed a sixth sense for passengers who were going to cause problems during the flight, and every instinct she possessed was sending warning signals about this particular traveler. "Sir, can I get you anything before takeoff?" Keisha asked David with the professional courtesy that airline training had drilled into her, despite her growing certainty that he was going to make her job significantly more difficult over the next few hours. "Perhaps some water or juice while we prepare for departure." David looked up at her with an expression that made her skin crawl, his eyes traveling over her face and uniform in a way that felt both dismissive and invasive at the same time. "Yeah, you can make sure that woman who was causing trouble at the gate doesn't end up sitting anywhere near me," he said loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear every word. "I paid good money for first class, and I don't want my flight ruined by having to deal with people who don't understand basic airport etiquette." Keisha felt her jaw tighten involuntarily, but years of customer service training had taught her to maintain her composure even when passengers said things that made her want to explain exactly what she thought of their attitudes and their apparent inability to treat other human beings with basic respect. "I'll make sure all our passengers have a comfortable flight, sir," she replied evenly. The diplomatic response that meant absolutely nothing, while avoiding any direct confrontation that could escalate into the kind of scene that required supervisor intervention. What Keisha knew, and what David was about to discover, was that the woman he was complaining about had already disappeared into the cockpit area, having been greeted by the flight crew with the kind of respectful attention usually reserved for airline executives or off-duty pilots riding in the jump seat. She had caught a glimpse of the woman's identification badge as she passed, and the name Captain Z. Johnson had made Keisha's eyes widen with recognition and something approaching excitement. Back in economy class, Emma Chen was bouncing slightly in her window seat as she pressed her face against the small oval of reinforced glass to watch the ground crew loading luggage and preparing the aircraft for departure. Her 8-year-old enthusiasm for flying completely undiminished by the ugly scene she had witnessed in the gate area. Her grandmother Lee sat beside her, still processing the hatred she had seen directed toward someone who had done nothing more threatening than exist in a space where someone else didn't think she belonged. "Grandma, why was that man so angry at the nice lady?" Emma asked with the directness that children brought to questions about adult behavior, that often revealed how little sense that behavior actually made when examined through innocent eyes. "She wasn't doing anything wrong, and she seemed really smart and kind like the pilots in my books who help people get safely to where they need to go." Grandmother Lee sighed softly, remembering her own experiences with Americans who had made it clear that they considered her presence in their country to be temporary and contingent on her willingness to remain invisible and grateful for whatever crumbs of acceptance they chose to offer. "Some people are afraid of change. Little butterfly," she said carefully, using the pet name she had given Emma when she was still learning to walk, and seemed to float through the world with impossible lightness. When they see someone different succeeding in places they think should be reserved for people who look like them, it makes them feel scared and small, so they try to make others feel small instead of dealing with their own fears. Emma considered this explanation with the seriousness that children brought to concepts that challenged their understanding of how the world was supposed to work according to the stories they had been told about fairness and justice, and everyone having equal opportunities to pursue their dreams. "But that's silly," she said finally. "There's enough sky for everyone to fly in, right? It's not like there's only room for one kind of pilot up there." The innocence of that observation hit Grandmother Lee like a physical blow because it captured exactly what the angry man at the gate had failed to understand, despite his obvious intelligence and expensive education. The sky really was big enough for everyone, but some people insisted on seeing the world as a zero-sum competition, where one person's success necessarily meant someone else's failure, as if dignity and respect were finite resources that had to be rationed rather than renewable qualities that grew stronger when they were shared freely. Meanwhile, David had spent the boarding process regaling anyone who would listen with his version of events from the gate area, carefully editing the story to cast himself as a reasonable person, defending airline standards against someone who had been aggressive and inappropriate, conveniently omitting the part where he had told a fellow passenger to go back to Africa for the crime of existing while black in a first-class boarding line. "I'm telling you, it's gotten completely out of hand," he said to the businessman across the aisle who had given up on his laptop and was now trapped in conversation with someone whose voice carried the manic energy of unresolved anger. "These people think they can just push their way to the front of every line, demand special treatment, and then act like victims when someone calls them out on their behavior. I was just standing up for the other passengers who were too polite to say anything." Inside the narrow confines of Flight 447's cockpit, Captain Zara Johnson settled into the left seat with the practiced ease of someone who had logged thousands of hours in similar aircraft, but never quite lost the thrill of being surrounded by the complex array of instruments and controls that transformed aluminum and fuel into the miracle of flight. Her movements were efficient and confident as she adjusted her seat position and headset, running through the mental checklist that had become second nature over 15 years of commercial aviation experience. Co-pilot James Rodriguez was already deep in his pre-flight procedures when Zara entered, his attention focused on the weather radar display that showed a line of afternoon thunderstorms building over the Great Plains that they would need to navigate around during their eastbound journey to Chicago. He glanced up briefly when she sat down, offering the kind of respectful nod that one professional gave to another when they were about to entrust their lives to each other's competence and judgment for the next several hours. "Afternoon," Captain James said without looking up from his instruments, his voice carrying the calm professionalism that made him an excellent co-pilot despite having only recently completed his upgrade training from regional jets to the wide-body aircraft that Horizon Airways used for their major route network. "We've got some weather to work around about an hour into the flight, but nothing that should cause major delays if we plan our route carefully." Zara nodded and began her own systematic review of the aircraft's status, checking everything from fuel quantities to hydraulic pressure to the dozens of other variables that had to align perfectly for safe flight operations. But part of her attention was focused on the muffled conversations she could hear filtering back from the passenger cabin through the partially open cockpit door. She had caught fragments of David Richardson's voice during boarding, and his tone suggested that the incident at the gate had not satisfied his apparent need to assert dominance over situations where he felt his authority was being challenged. "James, I need you to understand something about this flight," Zara said quietly, her tone carrying the weight of command authority, even though they were still parked at the gate with engines shut down. "We had a passenger incident during boarding involving racial harassment directed at me personally, and I have reason to believe this individual may continue to be disruptive during the flight." James's hands paused over his control panel as he processed this information, his expression shifting from routine professional focus to the heightened alertness that experienced flight crews developed when they sensed that a routine trip was about to become something more complicated and potentially dangerous. "Do you want me to have him removed before we push back?" he asked, already reaching for the radio that would connect him to ground operations and security personnel who could handle passenger problems while they were still safely on the ground. "Not yet." Zara replied, her fingers dancing across her tablet screen to access something that James had never seen before during their previous flights together. "I want to activate Clear Sky Protocol first and see how this situation develops once we're airborne. Sometimes people behave differently when they realize they're trapped in a metal tube with the people they've just insulted, especially when they discover that those people have more power than they initially assumed." Clear Sky Protocol was Zara's innovation developed after too many incidents where airline crews had to choose between tolerating passenger abuse or escalating confrontations that could derail entire flights and leave hundreds of innocent travelers stranded while security personnel sorted out disputes that could have been handled more effectively through proper documentation and strategic response. The system allowed crews to quietly record incidents, gather witness statements, and coordinate with ground operations to ensure that problematic passengers faced appropriate consequences without turning aircraft into airborne courtrooms. "I've never seen this protocol activated before," James said, watching as Zara's tablet displayed a series of options for incident classification, evidence collection, and response escalation that looked more sophisticated than anything he had encountered during his airline training. "Is this something new that corporate developed after those social media incidents last month?" Zara smiled slightly as she selected the appropriate options for documenting racial harassment and passenger disruption. Remembering the months of legal consultation and crew feedback that had gone into developing a system that protected both employees and passengers, while ensuring that incidents were handled with appropriate seriousness, rather than being dismissed as minor customer service issues that crews should simply endure as part of their job responsibilities. "I developed this protocol myself after experiencing similar situations where crews had no support and passengers faced no consequences for behavior that would be unacceptable in any other professional environment," she explained, her voice carrying a hint of pride mixed with the sadness that came from knowing such systems were necessary in the first place. Sometimes the best way to change institutional culture is to create better tools for the people who have to deal with these problems on a daily basis. The tablet chimed softly as the protocol activation was confirmed by ground operations, and Zara felt a familiar sense of calm settle over her as she transitioned from victim of harassment to pilot in command of an aircraft where her authority was absolute and unquestionable. She had learned long ago that the best response to people who tried to diminish her was to demonstrate exactly why they had made a serious mistake in their assessment of who held the real power in any given situation. "Tower, this is Horizon 447. Requesting clearance for pushback," Zara said into her headset, her voice carrying the crisp professionalism that air traffic controllers heard thousands of times every day from pilots who understood that aviation safety depended on clear communication and mutual respect between all parties involved in the complex dance of commercial flight operations. "Horizon 447, you are cleared for pushback runway 34L for departure," came the immediate response, followed by a pause that suggested the controller had something additional to communicate. "Captain Johnson, we've been advised that your flight is operating under Clear Sky Protocol today. Ground operations standing by for any assistance you might require." James raised an eyebrow at this exchange, beginning to understand that his captain had connections and resources that extended far beyond what he had assumed about their working relationship. But his questions would have to wait until after they were safely airborne and established in cruise flight, where conversation wouldn't interfere with the critical phases of takeoff and initial climb that required their complete attention and flawless execution. "Copy, Tower. Clear Sky acknowledged." Zara replied, her hand moving to the engine start switches as she began the process of transforming their stationary aircraft into a flying machine capable of carrying David Richardson and 180 other passengers to their destination, whether he approved of his pilot's skin color or not. As Flight 447 pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the departure runway, the passenger cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of pre-flight activities, with travelers adjusting their seats, organizing their entertainment devices, and mentally preparing themselves for the transition from ground-based life to the surreal experience of hurtling through the atmosphere in a pressurized metal tube that somehow remained aloft through principles of physics that most people preferred not to think about too carefully. David Richardson had claimed the window seat in row 2A as if it were his personal throne, spreading his belongings across both armrests and the empty middle seat beside him, while maintaining a running commentary about airline service standards that he directed toward anyone unfortunate enough to make eye contact with him during their journey down the aisle toward economy class seating that he clearly considered beneath his social status. "Keisha, isn't it?" David said, reading the name tag of the flight attendant as she performed her safety demonstration with the kind of professional cheerfulness that masked whatever personal opinions she might have about passengers who treated airline employees like servants rather than safety professionals. "I hope you understand that I'm going to need extra attention during this flight, given the stress I was subjected to during the boarding process by that disruptive woman who was causing problems at the gate." Keisha's smile remained perfectly professional, even as her internal temperature rose several degrees in response to David's casual revision of events that transformed him from aggressor to victim in a narrative that would have been laughable if it weren't so obviously sincere in his mind. "Sir, all of our passengers receive excellent service regardless of their seating class," she replied, using the tone that experienced flight attendants developed for managing difficult personalities without either escalating conflicts or compromising their own dignity. "Oh, I'm sure you do your best," David continued with the condescending tone that some people used when they wanted to establish their superiority over service workers while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. "But between you and me, don't you think it's important to maintain certain standards about who belongs in first class? I mean, I've been flying with this airline for 12 years, and I've never seen the kind of entitled behavior I witnessed today from people who clearly don't understand proper airport etiquette." The businessman in seat 3B looked up from his tablet with an expression that suggested he was finding it increasingly difficult to concentrate on his work while listening to David's barely disguised racism masquerading as concern about airline service standards. But like most passengers, he seemed uncertain about whether to intervene in a situation that didn't directly involve him, or simply hope that the flight attendant could handle the problem without requiring assistance from other travelers. Keisha felt her jaw tighten as she processed David's comments, recognizing the particular type of coded language that racist passengers used when they wanted to express their prejudices without using words that would clearly identify them as bigots to anyone who might be recording their conversations for social media posterity. She had dealt with similar passengers throughout her 3 years with Horizon Airways, but something about David's aggressive confidence suggested that he felt particularly safe expressing views that most people had learned to keep hidden. "Sir, I can assure you that all of our first-class passengers meet the same requirements, which is simply purchasing a first-class ticket through our reservation system," Keisha replied with the kind of patient precision that teachers used when explaining obvious concepts to students who seemed determined to misunderstand basic information. "Now, can I offer you something to drink before we reach cruising altitude?" But David was clearly warming up to his theme, encouraged by what he interpreted as Keisha's polite attention, rather than recognizing her responses as professional courtesy masking growing irritation with his behavior. "The problem is that these diversity programs have gotten completely out of hand," he continued, lowering his voice slightly as if he were sharing insider information rather than regurgitating talking points that he had absorbed from cable news programs that confirmed his existing prejudices. "Airlines are so worried about appearing inclusive that they've forgotten about taking care of the customers who actually built this industry through their loyalty and support. Emma Chen, seated several rows behind in economy class, had been listening to fragments of this conversation over the ambient noise of engine startup and passenger chatter, her young ears picking up the same tone of voice that adults used when they were saying things they knew were wrong but felt justified in expressing anyway. She tugged on her grandmother's sleeve and whispered a question that cut through all the political rhetoric and corporate speak to the heart of what was really happening in the first-class cabin. "Grandma, why is that man still being mean about the nice pilot lady?" Emma asked, with the clarity that children brought to situations where adults had tangled themselves up in justifications and explanations that obscured rather than illuminated the simple reality of one person treating another person badly for no reason other than the color of her skin. Grandmother Lee sighed quietly, recognizing that her granddaughter was receiving an education in human prejudice that she had hoped to delay for at least a few more years, but understanding that children who grew up in diverse societies needed to learn early how to recognize and respond to hatred that disguised itself as reasonable discourse about standards and qualifications and proper behavior. "Some people never learned to share their toys when they were your age," Grandmother Lee replied softly, using a metaphor that Emma could understand while avoiding the kind of complex historical and sociological explanations that would come later when the child was old enough to understand how centuries of oppression had created the attitudes that were currently poisoning the atmosphere in the front of their aircraft. Meanwhile, Keisha had moved on to serve other passengers, but she found herself listening carefully to David's ongoing commentary as he began targeting her personally with observations about diversity hiring practices and the declining quality of airline personnel that he attributed to what he described as political correctness gone wrong, as if the presence of black employees in customer service roles represented some kind of conspiracy against white passengers rather than the natural result of hiring qualified people regardless of their racial background. "I'm just saying," David announced to anyone within earshot when I started flying regularly 20 years ago, "you knew what to expect from airline crews. Professional standards meant something back then before everything became about checking boxes and making sure every group felt included instead of focusing on competence and experience." The words hung in the recycled air of the cabin like smoke from a fire that was growing larger and more dangerous with each passing minute. And several passengers began reaching for their phones with the instinctive understanding that they were witnessing something that would need to be documented and shared as evidence of the kind of casual racism that still infected American society despite decades of legal and social progress that was supposed to have made such incidents relics of an unenlightened past. The Boeing 757 reached its assigned cruising altitude of 37,000 feet with the smooth efficiency that characterized modern commercial aviation, and Captain Zara Johnson's voice filled the passenger cabin through the aircraft's public address system, with the routine announcements that travelers had heard thousands of times before, but which suddenly carried an entirely different weight given the events that had transpired during boarding and the ongoing commentary that continued to emanate from Seat 2A in the first-class cabin. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking." Zara's voice carried the calm authority that passengers expected to hear from the person responsible for safely delivering them to their destination. But David Richardson's head snapped up from his magazine with an expression of confused recognition as he processed the familiar tone and cadence of words that he had heard less than an hour earlier in a very different context. "Welcome aboard Horizon Airways Flight 447 with service to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. We're currently cruising at 37,000 feet with clear skies ahead and a slight tailwind that should help us arrive approximately 10 minutes ahead of our scheduled arrival time. Flight attendants, please prepare for beverage service as we've reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." David's magazine slipped from his fingers as the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized existed began falling into place in his mind, creating a picture that challenged every assumption he had made about power dynamics and social hierarchies during the confrontation at the gate. The voice coming through the speakers belonged to someone who commanded respect, not because of her race or gender, but because she held ultimate responsibility for the lives of every person aboard the aircraft, including his own. That can't be right, David muttered to himself, pulling out his phone to scroll through the flight information that he had barely glanced at when booking his ticket, suddenly desperate to find some evidence that would contradict the growing certainty that he had just made the worst mistake of his professional life by attacking someone whose authority in this particular environment was absolute and unquestionable. Keisha Williams moved through the cabin with renewed purpose, her professional demeanor now enhanced by the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing that David was about to receive an education in consequences that no business school or corporate training program could have prepared him to handle. She had recognized Captain Johnson's name immediately when reviewing the flight manifest, and the irony of David's situation was so perfect that she had to suppress a smile as she approached his seat with the beverage cart. "Mr. Richardson, can I offer you something to drink?" Keisha asked with exaggerated politeness, her tone carrying just enough emphasis to let him know that she was fully aware of the uncomfortable position he had placed himself in through his earlier comments about pilot competence and diversity hiring practices. "Who is your captain on this flight?" David asked with the desperate tone of someone who already knew the answer, but was hoping against hope that he was misunderstanding the situation that was rapidly spinning beyond his control. "I mean, what's his name and background? How long has he been flying for the airline?" "Our captain today is Zara Johnson," Keisha replied with perfect professional composure, emphasizing each syllable of the name that David had heard announced over the gate area speakers when security officers were asking if anyone had witnessed the harassment incident that he was trying very hard not to think about at the moment. "She's been with Horizon Airways since our founding, and she has over 15 years of commercial aviation experience flying everything from regional jets to wide-body international aircraft." Emma Chen had been coloring quietly in her economy seat when she heard the captain's announcement, but something about the voice made her look up from her artwork with the kind of instant recognition that children possessed before they learned to doubt their instincts about people and situations. "Grandma, that's the nice lady from the airport," she exclaimed loudly enough for several nearby passengers to hear. The one who was so calm and polite when the angry man was yelling at her. Grandmother Lee nodded slowly as she processed the implications of her granddaughter's observation, understanding that they were all about to witness a lesson in karma that would be talked about in their family for generations to come. "Yes, little butterfly," she said quietly. "It appears that the universe has a sense of humor about these things." The murmur of recognition began spreading through the cabin as passengers who had witnessed the gate incident began connecting the voice on the intercom with the woman who had maintained such remarkable composure while being subjected to racist attacks from a fellow traveler who was now discovering that his victim held considerably more power than he had assumed when he felt safe insulting her in the anonymous environment of a busy airport terminal. David's phone buzzed with text messages from business associates who had seen videos of the gate incident already spreading across social media platforms, their messages ranging from concern about his public relations nightmare to outright condemnation of his behavior. But he was too focused on the growing certainty that his problems were about to get exponentially worse to pay attention to the digital pylon that was gathering momentum among his professional network. "This has to be some kind of mistake," David said to the businessman across the aisle, his voice carrying the manic edge of someone whose world was collapsing in ways he had never imagined possible. "They can't seriously have put that woman in charge of flying this plane, can they? I mean, there have to be safety regulations about who's qualified to operate commercial aircraft, right?" The businessman looked up from his laptop with an expression that mixed pity with disgust, having listened to David's racist commentary for the past hour, and now watching him confront the reality that his prejudices had led him to drastically underestimate someone whose qualifications were obviously superior to his own in every measurable way. "Sir, I think you might want to consider keeping your opinions about the captain's qualifications to yourself for the remainder of this flight," he said quietly. But David's panic was rapidly overriding what little social awareness he possessed under normal circumstances and the thought of spending the next 2 hours trapped in an airplane with someone he had publicly humiliated was triggering a flight or fight response that unfortunately had no outlet at 37,000 feet above the Kansas prairie, where the nearest exit was a several-mile drop that would definitely not improve his current situation. The revelation that swept through Flight 447's cabin carried the electric energy of a thunderstorm building on the horizon as passengers began sharing information and connecting dots that painted a picture far more complex and embarrassing for David Richardson than anything his panicked mind was prepared to process during what had begun as a routine business trip to Chicago, but was rapidly transforming into a public humiliation that would follow him for the rest of his professional career. "Oh my God, do you know who Captain Johnson is?" whispered the woman in seat 4. To her husband, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had just realized they were witnessing something that would be replayed millions of times on social media and discussed in corporate training seminars for years to come. "She's not just any pilot. She's the CEO of Horizon Airways. She literally owns this airline." The information rippled through the cabin like wildfire spreading through dry grass, transforming confused murmurs into excited conversations as passengers pulled out their phones to verify what sounded too incredible to be true, but which explained everything about the calm confidence that Zara had displayed while being subjected to David's racist tirade in the gate area. Google searches confirmed what frequent flyers should have known already. Captain Zara Johnson had founded Horizon Airways 12 years earlier after being repeatedly passed over for pilot positions at major carriers building her company into one of the most successful regional airlines in the country through a combination of operational excellence and employee-focused policies that had earned industry recognition and customer loyalty. Emma Chen bounced excitedly in her economy seat as the adult conversations around her confirmed what her 8-year-old instincts had recognized immediately about the woman at the gate. "Grandma, she really is a captain," Emma exclaimed, her voice carrying the pure joy that children expressed when their heroes turned out to be even more amazing than they had imagined. "And she owns the whole airplane company. That's like being the queen of pilots, isn't it?" Grandmother Lee smiled at her granddaughter's enthusiasm while watching David Richardson's face cycle through expressions of disbelief, panic, and something approaching physical illness as he processed the magnitude of his mistake. "Yes, little butterfly," she said gently. "Sometimes the people who deserve our respect the most are the ones who have worked the hardest to earn it, even when others try to tell them they don't belong." Up in the first-class cabin, David was experiencing what could only be described as a complete psychological meltdown, as the reality of his situation penetrated his consciousness like ice water flooding his nervous system. The woman he had told to go back to Africa was not only the pilot responsible for his safe arrival in Chicago, but also the chief executive officer of the company, whose stock he had been considering purchasing for his investment portfolio just 3 months earlier, when Horizon Airways had been featured in business magazines as one of the fastest-growing airlines in the competitive regional aviation market. "This can't be happening," David muttered to himself, scrolling frantically through his phone's browser to find some evidence that would contradict what seemed to be the consensus opinion of everyone around him. But every search result confirmed the same basic facts about Captain Johnson's background achievements and current role as both pilot and CEO of the airline whose first-class seat he was occupying while having what could charitably be described as a complete nervous breakdown. Keisha Williams approached David's seat with the beverage cart, her professional composure now enhanced by the quiet satisfaction of watching someone receive a lesson in consequences that was both immediate and perfectly calibrated to his level of arrogance and ignorance. "Mr. Richardson, you mentioned earlier that you were concerned about pilot qualifications," she said with exaggerated helpfulness. "Would you like me to share Captain Johnson's credentials with you? She has over 15,000 flight hours and MBA from Northwestern and was recognized by Aviation Week as CEO of the Year just 2 months ago." The businessman across the aisle was no longer pretending to work on his laptop, instead, openly watching David's psychological collapse with the fascination that people reserved for train wrecks and reality television shows that featured people humiliating themselves in spectacular fashion. "You know," he said conversationally, "I'm actually flying to Chicago for a conference on corporate leadership and crisis management. I have a feeling Captain Johnson's handling of this situation is going to provide some excellent case study material for my presentation." David's hands were visibly shaking as he attempted to compose text messages to his business partner that would somehow explain his current predicament, without admitting that his racist assumptions had led him to attack the CEO of a major airline in full view of dozens of witnesses who were already sharing video footage across every social media platform that existed. The notifications on his phone were increasing exponentially as his gate area meltdown went viral among aviation enthusiasts, civil rights advocates, and business professionals who specialized in analyzing corporate public relations disasters. "I need to speak to the captain immediately," David announced to Keisha with the desperate authority of someone who still believed that his status as a first-class passenger gave him the right to make demands about aircraft operations, despite growing evidence that his influence in this particular situation was approximately equivalent to that of a piece of checked luggage that happened to have opinions about flight planning procedures. "I'm afraid Captain Johnson is occupied with flying the aircraft," Sir Keisha replied with the kind of patience that teachers used when explaining obvious concepts to particularly slow students. "But I'm sure she's aware of your concerns given that this flight is operating under clear sky protocol due to the harassment incident that occurred during boarding." The mention of clear sky protocol sent another wave of panic through David's already overwhelmed nervous system, because it sounded like the kind of official procedure that would involve documentation, investigation, and consequences that extended far beyond the temporary embarrassment of being publicly humiliated by someone he had drastically underestimated. His business instincts, what remained of them after his emotional collapse, warned him that he was facing the kind of corporate crisis that could destroy careers and reputations permanently, if not handled with extreme care and genuine contrition. Emma Chen had been listening to the adult conversations around her with the intense focus that children brought to situations where they sensed that important lessons were being taught about fairness, justice, and the consequences of treating other people badly for no reason other than prejudice and ignorance. "Grandma," she said quietly, "do you think the mean man understands now why it's wrong to be cruel to people who are different from him?" Grandmother Lee considered her granddaughter's question carefully, watching David's face as he scrolled through social media posts that documented his racist outburst and the subsequent revelation of his target's identity and qualifications. "I think he's beginning to understand that his words have consequences." "Little butterfly," she replied. "Sometimes people need to feel ashamed before they can learn to feel sorry. And shame is a teacher that never lets its students forget the lessons they need to learn." At 37,000 feet above the American heartland, with autopilot engaged and all flight systems operating normally, Captain Zara Johnson made a decision that would transform a routine domestic flight into a masterclass in leadership dignity and the power of calm authority in the face of ignorance and prejudice. She unbuckled her restraints, stood from the pilot's seat with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable with her own competence, and informed co-pilot James Rodriguez that she would be leaving the flight deck for a few minutes to address a passenger issue that required her personal attention. "Captain, are you sure that's advisable?" James asked with the concern of someone who understood that aircraft commanders rarely left their posts during flight unless circumstances demanded immediate intervention in situations that couldn't be handled through standard crew protocols. "I can notify the lead flight attendant if there's a problem in the cabin that needs to be addressed. This particular problem requires a response from someone with the authority to make decisions that will affect this passenger's future relationship with our airline," Zara replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done and having the power to do it without requiring anyone's permission or approval. Keep us on course for Chicago, and be prepared to document whatever conversation takes place in the cabin for our Clear Sky Protocol incident report." Zara walked from the cockpit into the passenger cabin with the measured pace of someone who had learned to command attention through presence rather than volume. Her captain's uniform immediately identifying her to passengers who had been speculating about her identity and qualifications while watching David Richardson's increasingly desperate attempts to manage a public relations crisis that was entirely of his own making. The conversations that had been buzzing throughout the aircraft fell silent as she moved down the narrow aisle, her calm demeanor providing a stark contrast to the emotional chaos that had been radiating from the first-class cabin for the past hour. Emma Chen saw Captain Johnson first, and immediately abandoned her coloring book to wave enthusiastically at the woman who had become her hero through a combination of professional competence and grace under pressure that the 8-year-old recognized as the qualities she wanted to embody when she became old enough to pursue her own dreams of flight. Captain Johnson. Emma called out with the uninhibited joy that children expressed when they encountered someone they admired. "Thank you for being such a good pilot and for being nice to everyone, even when some people aren't nice to you." The spontaneous applause that followed Emma's greeting rippled through the economy cabin as passengers recognized both the courage of a child who spoke truth without fear and the dignity of a woman who had maintained her professionalism despite being subjected to treatment that would have broken the composure of most people in similar circumstances. Zara paused beside Emma's seat, accepting the drawing that the little girl thrust toward her with an expression that suggested this particular artwork would be treasured far more than any corporate award or professional recognition she might receive throughout her career. "Thank you, Emma," Zara said quietly, studying the crayon drawing of a female pilot surrounded by children of all colors who were reaching toward the sky with expressions of hope and determination. "This is beautiful, and it reminds me why I love flying, because the sky really is big enough for everyone who dreams of touching the clouds." David Richardson watched this interaction from his first-class seat with the growing realization that he had not simply insulted a fellow passenger or airline employee, but had attacked someone whose response to his hatred would be witnessed by hundreds of people who were already sharing the story across social media platforms that would ensure his racist outburst became permanent internet history that would follow him for the rest of his personal and professional life. Zara continued her walk toward the front of the aircraft, stopping directly beside David's seat, with the calm authority of someone who held absolute power in this particular environment and intended to use it responsibly but firmly to address behavior that threatened the safety and comfort of her crew and passengers. She looked down at him with the same clinical assessment that she might give to weather patterns or mechanical systems that required careful analysis before making critical decisions about flight safety and operational procedures. "Mr. Richardson," she said evenly, her voice carrying across the now silent cabin with perfect clarity. "I believe we had an interaction at the gate that requires some clarification now that we're airborne, and you have time to consider your words more carefully." David's mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to find words that would somehow undo the damage he had inflicted on his own reputation, while providing some face-saving explanation for behavior that had no reasonable justification beyond the prejudices that he was rapidly discovering were not shared by the majority of people around him who were watching this confrontation with expressions that ranged from fascination to disgust. I didn't know." David stammered, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the aircraft's environmental systems, and the held breath of passengers who understood they were witnessing something that would be discussed and analyzed for years to come, in contexts ranging from business schools to diversity training seminars. "You didn't know what exactly," Zara asked, with the patience of someone who was determined to extract a complete acknowledgement of wrongdoing rather than accepting the kind of partial apology that allowed people to maintain plausible deniability about their motivations and actions. "You didn't know that I was qualified to be in first class? You didn't know that I was an airline pilot? Or you didn't know that your assumptions about who belongs where were completely incorrect. The questions hung in the recycled air of the cabin like accusations that demanded honest answers rather than the kind of corporate speak that David usually relied on when he needed to deflect responsibility for his mistakes and poor judgment. Every passenger within earshot was recording this exchange on their phones, ensuring that his response would be preserved forever, as evidence of either genuine remorse or continued attempts to avoid accountability for behavior that reflected poorly on his character and upbringing. "I was wrong," David finally managed to say, though his voice carried more desperation than genuine contrition. "I was having a bad day, and I took out my frustrations on someone who didn't deserve that treatment. I'm sorry for what I said, and I understand if you want to file a complaint or take some kind of action against me." Zara studied his face for a long moment, reading the mixture of fear, shame, and calculation that suggested he was more concerned about protecting himself from consequences than understanding the harm his words had inflicted on others who had to navigate a world where such attacks were routine, rather than exceptional experiences that could be dismissed as isolated incidents of bad judgment. Captain Zara Johnson stood in the aisle of her own aircraft, looking down at a man whose racist assumptions had led him to attack someone whose authority in this environment was absolute, and whose response would determine whether he faced simple embarrassment or consequences that would follow him far beyond the confines of Flight 447. And she made a decision that would demonstrate the difference between punishment and education, between revenge and transformation. "Mr. Richardson, your apology is noted and recorded as part of our Clear Sky Protocol documentation," she said calmly, her voice carrying the professional authority that had guided her through countless emergencies both in the air and in boardrooms, where her competence had been questioned by people who shared David's assumptions about who belonged in positions of power and responsibility. "However, I think it's important for you and the other passengers to understand that this situation represents more than just a personal conflict between two individuals." The cabin fell into absolute silence as passengers recognized that they were about to receive a lesson in leadership that would stay with them far longer than any corporate training seminar or diversity workshop they might attend throughout their careers, delivered by someone whose qualifications to speak on these topics had been earned through decades of overcoming obstacles that most people would never have to face in their professional lives. "When you told me to go back to Africa, you weren't just attacking me personally." Zara continued, her tone remaining calm and measured, despite the emotion that flickered briefly across her face as she processed the impact of words that carried centuries of hatred and exclusion. "You were attacking every person of color who has ever been told they don't belong in spaces they've earned the right to occupy through their talent, dedication, and hard work." Emma Chen listened to Captain Johnson's words with the intense focus that children brought to moments when adults were explaining important concepts about fairness and justice, and her 8-year-old voice cut through the cabin's silence with a question that captured the moral clarity that prejudice tried to obscure through complicated justifications and rationalized hatred. "Mr. Richardson," Emma said loudly enough for everyone to hear her young voice carrying no trace of anger or accusation, only genuine curiosity about human behavior that didn't make sense to someone who had been taught to treat all people with basic respect. "Why did you think it was okay to be mean to Captain Johnson when she was just trying to get on the airplane like everyone else?" The question hit David like a physical blow because it stripped away all the adult complexity and political rhetoric that he had used to justify his prejudices, reducing his behavior to its essential components. An adult man choosing to be cruel to another person for no reason other than the color of her skin, witnessed by a child who understood immediately that such cruelty was wrong, regardless of whatever sophisticated explanations might be offered to excuse it. I don't have a good answer for that," David replied, his voice breaking slightly as he looked at Emma's earnest face and realized that an 8-year-old had demonstrated more wisdom and moral courage than he had managed to display throughout his 45 years of life. I was angry about things that had nothing to do with Captain Johnson, and I said things that were wrong and hurtful because I wasn't thinking clearly about how my words would affect other people. Zara nodded slightly, recognizing that David's response to Emma's question showed more genuine understanding than anything he had said to her directly, because children had a way of cutting through adult defenses to reach whatever capacity for empathy might still exist beneath layers of learned prejudice and social conditioning that taught people to see difference as threat rather than strength. Mr. Richardson, our clear sky protocol isn't designed to punish passengers for making mistakes, Zara explained, her voice taking on the instructional tone that experienced teachers used when they wanted to ensure their students understood important concepts that would serve them well beyond the immediate context of their current lesson. It's designed to document incidents like this one so that we can address patterns of behavior that make air travel uncomfortable or unsafe for our crews and passengers, while also providing opportunities for people to learn from their mistakes, rather than simply facing punishment that doesn't address the underlying attitudes that create these problems. Keisha Williams stood nearby with her tablet documenting the entire conversation for the incident report that would become part of Horizon Airways' database of passenger behavior incidents. But she found herself impressed by her CEO's handling of a situation that could easily have escalated into the kind of viral confrontation that destroyed careers and reputations without creating any meaningful change in the attitudes that made such confrontations necessary in the first place. What this means practically, Zara continued, is that you'll have the opportunity to participate in our passenger education program, which includes workshops on unconscious bias, cultural competency, and the impact of discriminatory language on airline operations and passenger safety. Because when people feel threatened or unwelcome in transportation environments, it affects everyone's ability to travel safely and comfortably. The passengers around David were listening to this explanation with expressions that ranged from admiration for Captain Johnson's professionalism to amazement that someone who had been subjected to such treatment was offering education rather than seeking maximum punishment for behavior that would have justified much more severe consequences than bias training workshops and mandatory reflection exercises. Captain Johnson said the businessman who had been sitting across from David throughout the flight, "I have to say that your handling of this situation is exactly the kind of leadership that we discuss in corporate management seminars, but rarely see demonstrated in real-world crisis situations where people are dealing with genuine hostility and disrespect." Emma raised her hand as if she were in a classroom waiting for permission to speak until Captain Johnson nodded in her direction with the kind of patient attention that suggested she understood that children often provided the most important insights during difficult conversations about human behavior and moral responsibility. "Captain Johnson, does this mean that Mr. Richardson can learn to be nicer to people who look different from him?" Emma asked with the optimism that children brought to questions about whether adults could change their behavior when they understood that their actions were causing harm to others who deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. "I certainly hope so," Emma Zara replied, looking directly at David as she spoke. "People can change when they're willing to examine their assumptions and work on understanding how their words and actions affect others. But it requires genuine commitment to doing better, rather than just feeling sorry about getting caught behaving badly." As Flight 447 began its approach into Chicago O'Hare International Airport, the atmosphere in the passenger cabin had transformed completely from the tension and anger that had characterized the early portion of the flight into something approaching a shared understanding that everyone aboard had witnessed something significant that would stay with them far beyond the time it took to collect their baggage and continue with their respective journeys through life. Captain Zara Johnson's voice came over the intercom with the routine announcements about preparing for landing, checking seat backs and tray tables, and ensuring that electronic devices were properly stowed, but her words carried additional weight. Now that every passenger understood exactly who was guiding their aircraft safely back to Earth after an experience that had challenged assumptions about power, dignity, and the consequences of allowing prejudice to guide human interactions. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final descent into Chicago O'Hare, where the weather is clear with light winds and excellent visibility for what should be a smooth landing, Zara announced with the calm professionalism that had characterized her handling of every aspect of this flight, from the technical challenges of navigation to the human challenges of addressing discriminatory behavior in a way that promoted understanding rather than simply seeking retribution for personal insults. David Richardson sat in his first-class seat staring out the window at the lights of Chicago spreading across the horizon below, but his mind was focused on the email he was composing on his phone to his business partner and the dozens of other messages he would need to send to clients, colleagues, and family members who were already asking questions about the viral videos that had captured his racist outburst and the subsequent revelation of his target's identity and qualifications. The descent gave him time to process what had happened during the past 3 hours, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he was starting to understand that his problems extended far beyond the immediate embarrassment of being publicly humiliated by someone he had drastically underestimated. His behavior had been recorded and shared across social media platforms, where it would remain forever as evidence of the kind of person he revealed himself to be when he thought he held power over others who looked different from him. Emma Chen was bouncing excitedly in her economy seat as she watched the city lights grow larger through her window, but her enthusiasm was focused less on their arrival than on the conversation she planned to have with her parents about the amazing captain who had handled the mean man's cruel words with such grace and strength that even an 8-year-old could recognize the difference between someone who commanded respect through fear and someone who earned it through competence and character. "Grandma, when I grow up and become a pilot like Captain Johnson, I want to be just as calm and smart when people are mean to me," Emma declared with the certainty that children brought to their dreams before the world taught them to doubt their ability to achieve whatever goals captured their imagination and determination. She showed everyone that being professional and kind is stronger than being angry and loud. Didn't she? Grandmother Lee smiled at her granddaughter's insight, recognizing that the child had absorbed lessons about leadership and dignity that many adults never learned, despite having access to expensive education and corporate training programs that focused on management techniques rather than character development. "Yes, little butterfly," she replied softly. Captain Johnson demonstrated that real power comes from knowing who you are and staying true to your values even when others try to make you feel small or unwelcome. The businessman who had witnessed David's behavior throughout the flight was already drafting notes for the presentation he would give at his leadership conference. Understanding that he had observed a masterclass in crisis management that would provide more valuable insights than any theoretical case study he might have planned to discuss with his audience of executives who faced similar challenges in their own organizations when dealing with employees or customers whose prejudices created toxic environments for other people. As the aircraft touched down with the gentle bump that characterized Captain Johnson's expert handling of the landing procedures, spontaneous applause erupted throughout the cabin. Not the polite recognition that passengers sometimes offered after particularly smooth flights, but genuine appreciation for someone whose professionalism had transformed a potentially destructive incident into an educational experience that reminded everyone aboard about the importance of treating others with basic human dignity. Keisha Williams moved through the cabin preparing passengers for deplaning while mentally composing the incident report that would document every aspect of David's behavior and Captain Johnson's response for the Clear Sky Protocol database that would help other airline crews handle similar situations with the same combination of firmness and educational opportunity that had characterized this particular confrontation. David remained in his seat as other first-class passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark, knowing that his problems were just beginning as he contemplated the phone calls he would need to make to explain his behavior to clients who were already expressing concern about their association with someone who had demonstrated such poor judgment and basic human decency in a public setting that had been witnessed by hundreds of people and recorded for posterity. Mr. Richardson, Keisha said as she approached his seat during the deplaning process. Captain Johnson has asked me to inform you that a representative from our customer service team will be contacting you within the next 24 hours to discuss your participation in our passenger education program and to answer any questions you might have about our Clear Sky Protocol procedures. The jet bridge at Chicago O'Hare International Airport felt like a transition space between the controlled environment of the aircraft, where Captain Johnson's authority had been absolute, and the larger world where David Richardson would face consequences that extended far beyond airline policies and passenger education programs into the realm of social media, virality, professional reputation, management, and personal soul-searching that would determine whether he learned genuine lessons from his public humiliation or simply found new ways to rationalize his prejudices. As passengers filed off Flight 447, many paused to thank Captain Johnson personally for her handling of both the technical aspects of their journey and the human drama that had unfolded during what was supposed to be a routine domestic flight. Their comments reflecting genuine admiration for someone who had demonstrated that real leadership meant maintaining professionalism and seeking constructive solutions even when facing personal attacks that would have justified much harsher responses. Captain Johnson: I've been flying for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone handle a difficult situation with such grace and wisdom, said an elderly gentleman who had observed the entire confrontation from his economy seat. You turned what could have been a terrible experience for everyone into a lesson about dignity and respect that I'll remember for the rest of my life. Emma Chen was among the last passengers to leave the aircraft, having convinced her grandmother to wait so she could personally thank the woman who had become her hero through a combination of professional excellence and moral courage that the 8-year-old recognized as qualities worth emulating throughout her own life. Captain Johnson: Thank you for showing everyone that being different makes you special. Not wrong, Emma said with the clarity that children brought to complex social issues that adults often obscured with political rhetoric and cultural justifications. Thank you, Emma, Zara replied, kneeling to the child's eye level with the patient attention that suggested she understood the importance of encouraging young dreamers who might face their own challenges when pursuing goals in fields where people who looked like them were underrepresented. Remember that the sky belongs to everyone who's brave enough to reach for it, and don't let anyone convince you that your dreams are too big or that you don't belong wherever your talents and hard work take you. David remained aboard the aircraft long after the other passengers had departed, sitting alone in the first-class cabin that had become the site of his personal and professional downfall as he contemplated the magnitude of the mistake he had made and tried to develop some strategy for managing the crisis that his racist outburst had created for his business, his relationships, and his understanding of himself as someone who had always considered his prejudices to be reasonable rather than harmful. Mr. Richardson, Zara said, as she approached his seat after ensuring that all other passengers had safely deplaned. I think it would be beneficial for both of us if we had a private conversation about what happened today and what steps you might take to address the underlying attitudes that led to your behavior at the gate and during the early part of our flight. David looked up at her with an expression that mixed shame, fear, and something approaching genuine remorse as he processed the fact that someone he had attempted to humiliate was now offering him an opportunity for redemption, rather than simply documenting his behavior for whatever legal or professional consequences might follow from his public display of racism and poor judgment. I don't understand why you're being so kind to me after what I said to you, David replied, his voice barely audible as he struggled with emotions that he had spent most of his adult life avoiding through anger, blame, and the kind of defensive hostility that had characterized his response to anyone who challenged his assumptions about how the world should work. I was horrible to you, and you would be completely justified in making sure that I faced serious consequences for my behavior. Mr. Richardson, revenge doesn't teach people anything except fear, and fear doesn't change hearts or minds, Zara explained with the patient wisdom that came from years of facing discrimination and choosing education over retaliation as her primary response to ignorance and hatred. I'm interested in transformation, not punishment, because the world needs fewer people who think like you did today and more people who understand that diversity makes us stronger, rather than threatening whatever advantages they think they're entitled to based on nothing more than the circumstances of their birth. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 40 minutes as Zara guided David through a process of reflection and acknowledgement that forced him to confront the assumptions, fears, and learned prejudices that had shaped his worldview and justified behavior that had caused real harm to others while ultimately damaging his own reputation and relationships in ways that he was only beginning to understand. "I keep thinking about what that little girl asked me," David said, finally referring to Emma's question about why he had chosen to be mean to someone who was simply trying to board an airplane like any other passenger. "I don't have a good answer because there isn't one. I was cruel to you because I was angry about my own failures, and I took that anger out on someone who represented everything I thought was wrong with a world that wasn't giving me what I felt I deserved." "That's probably the most honest thing you've said since this whole incident began," Zara replied, recognizing the difference between genuine self-reflection and the kind of calculated apologies that people offered when they were more concerned about managing consequences than understanding their own behavior. "The question now is whether you're willing to do the work necessary to address those underlying attitudes, or whether you'll go back to blaming others for problems that ultimately stem from your own choices and character." The viral video began spreading across social media platforms before Flight 447 had even reached its gate at Chicago O'Hare, with passengers who had witnessed the confrontation sharing footage and commentary that would ultimately reach millions of viewers around the world who were hungry for stories about justice, accountability, and the satisfaction that came from watching people face immediate consequences for behavior that reflected the worst aspects of human nature, rather than the better angels that most people hoped guided their interactions with fellow travelers through life. Within 6 hours of the flight's arrival, #Captain Johnson was trending on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as aviation enthusiasts, civil rights advocates, business professionals, and ordinary citizens shared the story of an airline CEO whose response to racist harassment had demonstrated the kind of leadership that transformed ugly moments into educational opportunities while maintaining the dignity and professionalism that characterized people who understood that real power meant lifting others up rather than tearing them down. David Richardson's public apology video, recorded in his Chicago hotel room with the haunted expression of someone whose world had collapsed in ways he never could have imagined when he woke up that morning in Denver, went viral for different reasons. As viewers analyzed his words and body language for signs of genuine remorse versus calculated damage control designed to minimize the professional and personal consequences of his behavior. "My name is David Richardson, and I want to apologize without reservation for the racist comments I made to Captain Zara Johnson at Denver International Airport and during the early portion of Horizon Airways Flight 447 to Chicago," he said, reading from notes he had written and rewritten dozens of times, while trying to find words that would convey genuine understanding rather than hollow regret about getting caught behaving badly in public. "There is no excuse for telling another human being to go back to Africa, and there is no justification for the assumptions I made about Captain Johnson's qualifications, character, or right to be treated with the same respect that I expect for myself when I travel. My behavior was wrong, harmful, and reflected prejudices that I am committed to addressing through education, reflection, and whatever actions are necessary to ensure that I never again cause this kind of pain to another person." The response to David's apology was mixed, with some viewers expressing appreciation for his apparent willingness to take responsibility for his actions, while others remained skeptical about whether his remorse was genuine or simply motivated by fear of further consequences to his reputation and livelihood. Social media comment sections filled with debates about redemption, accountability, and whether people who expressed racist views in public deserved opportunities to learn and grow or should face permanent social and professional ostracism for revealing their true character under pressure. Meanwhile, Captain Zara Johnson's handling of the incident was being analyzed and praised by leadership experts, diversity consultants, and airline industry professionals who recognized that her approach had created a teaching moment that would benefit far more people than a simple punishment-based response that focused on retribution rather than education and transformation. What we witnessed on Flight 447 represents the gold standard for crisis leadership, said Dr. Patricia Williams, a professor of organizational behavior at Northwestern University who had studied workplace discrimination for over 20 years. Captain Johnson demonstrated that the most effective responses to bias and harassment combine accountability with opportunity, ensuring that people face consequences for harmful behavior, while also providing pathways for learning and growth that benefit everyone involved. Emma Chen's parents, who had been waiting for her arrival at O'Hare and heard the story from their daughter and her grandmother during the ride home from the airport, struggled to process the fact that their 8-year-old had played a role in what was rapidly becoming one of the most discussed incidents of airline passenger behavior in recent memory. Though they felt proud that Emma's response had reflected the values they had tried to instill in her about treating all people with kindness and respect, regardless of their appearance or background. Mom, Captain Johnson told me that the sky belongs to everyone who's brave enough to reach for it, Emma explained to her parents as they tucked her into bed that night, her young mind already processing the lessons she had learned about courage, dignity, and the importance of standing up for people who were being treated unfairly by others who should have known better. I'm going to remember that when I become a pilot someday, and I'm going to make sure that everyone feels welcome on my airplanes. The immediate impact on Horizon Airways was overwhelmingly positive, as the airline's stock price rose on news that their CEO had demonstrated exactly the kind of principled leadership that investors wanted to see from companies operating in industries where customer service and employee relations were critical to long-term success. Booking inquiries increased dramatically as travelers expressed preference for flying with an airline whose leader had shown such grace under pressure, while maintaining professional standards that created safe and respectful environments for everyone aboard their aircraft. For David Richardson, the aftermath was more complicated as his consulting firm lost 3 major clients within 48 hours of the video's viral spread, while former colleagues and business associates distanced themselves from someone whose public behavior had revealed character flaws that they preferred not to have associated with their own professional reputations and personal brands. The phone calls and emails he received ranged from disappointed friends offering support for his rehabilitation efforts to business partners demanding immediate resignation from projects and partnerships that could be damaged by association with his racist outburst. Keisha Williams found herself promoted to lead Horizon Airways' new passenger relations training program, which would teach airline employees across the industry how to handle bias incidents using the Clear Sky protocol that Captain Johnson had developed to ensure that discrimination was documented, addressed, and transformed into opportunities for education, rather than simply ignored or minimized as minor customer service issues that crews should tolerate as part of their job responsibilities. 6 months after Flight 447 became one of the most discussed examples of crisis leadership in aviation history. Emma Chen celebrated her 9th birthday by taking her first official flying lesson at a small airport outside Chicago, where her instructor was amazed by the 8-year-old's knowledge of aviation procedures and her mature understanding of what it meant to command an aircraft responsibly while treating all passengers with the dignity and respect they deserved, regardless of their background or appearance. The lesson was arranged as a surprise gift from Captain Zara Johnson, who had stayed in touch with the Chen family after receiving dozens of letters from Emma filled with drawings of diverse flight crews and detailed plans for the airline she intended to establish when she became old enough to turn her childhood dreams into adult achievements that would make the aviation industry more welcoming for everyone who shared her passion for flight. Emma, You have natural instincts for flying that remind me of myself when I was your age and convinced that airplanes were magic machines that could carry people above all the small-minded thinking that kept them trapped on the ground. Captain Johnson told her young protege as they walked around the training aircraft together, checking control surfaces and discussing the principles of lift, thrust, drag, and weight that governed everything from paper airplanes to the massive commercial jets that crossed oceans every day, carrying hundreds of passengers safely to their destinations. Meanwhile, David Richardson was completing the final session of his voluntary participation in the most comprehensive bias education program that Horizon Airways had ever developed, a 12-week course that combined psychological counseling, historical education, and practical exercises designed to help people recognize and address the unconscious prejudices that shaped their interactions with others who looked, spoke, or thought differently than they did. The transformation in David's understanding and behavior had been gradual but genuine, beginning with his willingness to acknowledge that his racist outburst had stemmed from deeper problems with his worldview and his inability to handle personal failures without finding scapegoats to blame for circumstances that were largely of his own making. His participation in the program had been voluntary rather than court-ordered, reflecting Captain Johnson's belief that real change had to come from internal motivation rather than external coercion. "David, you've demonstrated remarkable growth throughout this process," said Dr. Sarah Martinez, the program coordinator who had guided him through months of difficult self-examination and honest conversation about the privilege, fear, and learned prejudices that had shaped his responses to diversity and change. "The question now is how you'll apply these insights to rebuild relationships and create positive impact in your professional and personal communities." David's consulting firm had survived the initial crisis created by his viral racist outburst, though he had been forced to cede day-to-day management responsibilities to his business partner, while focusing on repairing his reputation through genuine community service and public speaking about the dangers of unchecked prejudice in professional environments where diverse teams were essential for innovation and success. His relationship with his daughter Rachel had actually improved as a result of the incident and its aftermath, because his participation in bias education had forced him to examine not only his attitudes about race, but also his assumptions about gender, class, and other forms of diversity that would shape his daughter's experiences as she grew up in a world very different from the one he had known during his own childhood and early career. The aviation industry had embraced the Clear Sky Protocol as a model for handling passenger misconduct incidents that involved bias, harassment, or discrimination, with over 40 airlines implementing similar systems that emphasized documentation, education, and transformation, rather than simply removing problematic passengers without addressing the underlying attitudes that created toxic environments for crews and fellow travelers. Captain Zara Johnson received the Aviation Industry Leadership Award at a ceremony attended by executives, pilots, and flight attendants from airlines around the world, who recognized that her handling of the Flight 447 incident had established new standards for professional response to discrimination, while demonstrating that diversity in leadership positions created stronger, more resilient organizations capable of handling complex challenges with wisdom and grace. During her acceptance speech, Captain Johnson held up Emma Chen's original drawing of a female pilot surrounded by children of different races and ethnicities reaching toward the sky, explaining that this artwork had become the symbol of her vision for an aviation industry where everyone who dreamed of flying would find pathways to pursue their goals, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. "The sky really is big enough for all of us," she concluded, looking out at an audience that included Emma and her family in the front row, David Richardson in the back corner, where he sat quietly applauding the woman whose grace under pressure had saved him from himself, and hundreds of aviation professionals who understood that they had witnessed leadership that would influence their industry for generations to come. As the ceremony ended and people began to disperse into the evening air outside the convention center, Emma ran up to Captain Johnson with another drawing, this one showing two pilots, one who looked like Captain Johnson and another who looked like Emma herself, standing together in front of an airplane with the words, "Dreams take flight," written in careful cursive across the bottom of the page. Captain Johnson, when I get my pilot's license in 10 years, will you fly with me on my first official flight as a captain? Emma asked with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that her dreams were achievable goals, rather than impossible fantasies that existed only in the imagination of children who hadn't yet learned that the world placed limits on who could aspire to positions of authority and responsibility. Emma, it would be my honor to fly with you. Captain Johnson replied, accepting the drawing and thinking about how one moment of ugliness at an airport gate had somehow transformed into this beautiful vision of the future, where a 9-year-old girl could see herself commanding aircraft because she had witnessed someone who looked like her demonstrate that altitude really was about perspective. And the highest perspective was one that saw infinite possibilities for everyone brave enough to reach for them. If this story of courage overcoming prejudice moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share this video with others who believe that dignity and respect should define how we treat each other regardless of our differences. Captain Johnson's example reminds us that real strength comes not from putting others down, but from lifting everyone up to reach their highest potential. Together, we can build a world where every child who dreams of touching the sky finds the support and opportunity they need to make those dreams reality.